Setting the stage for American foreign policy in the emergence of the 21st century, it is useful to reflect upon the 1990s. Remember at first that Americans involved with the United States Armed Forces, or the USAF, were extremely apprehensive to use ground forces, although some of the leadership called for it, and relied very heavily upon the air war, taking this as a quote-unquote lesson from Second Indochina. American foreign policy in the case of Somalia, the Balkans, and Rwanda during the Clinton administration can be seen as a sort of balance between the valuation of international understandings about human rights and democracy on the one hand, attempting to capture the legacy of the Carter administration, and a more pragmatic and hawkish approach to American interests, quote unquote, on the other hand. This set the stage for a new era of American foreign policy, which emerges during the course of the 43rd presidency of the United States, the George W. Bush administration. Before we begin a discussion of Bush's quote unquote war on terror, we must first actually give an example of what terrorism is. Could you think of 2 or 3 examples here? You might look at the image here for inspiration, think about what the image is. And you could, of course, think about other historical cases. So again, what is terrorism? Give your own definition and a couple of examples. Now, building on the thread, take a few minutes and think about George W. Bush's quote-unquote war on terror. How would you define the war on terror as it relates to George W. Bush's foreign policy? And then also in this case, give 2 to 3 supporting details. This is quite a big topic, so I'm sure that you can come up with some evidence. Moving forward, I'd like to point out a quotable quote from Rudy Giuliani, a lawyer and also former mayor of New York. In Ohio in 2016, he stated in public during the course of a major event on camera, quote, "Under those 8 years before Obama came along, we didn't have any successful radical Islamic terrorist attack in the United States." Immediately, this garnered some criticism from people who were actually paying attention. Because, of course, and there is much debate about how to define the events, but Rudy Giuliani was actually mayor of New York City from January 1994 all the way through the summer of 2001, through August of 2001, through September of 2001, through October of 2001, to November and December of 2001. Perhaps it was intentional, perhaps it was amnesia, nonetheless. There are some numerous quotable quotes from Giuliani that are controversial. Let's just say that he is not the most apt figure with words when it comes to public speeches, but also there's something else that's quite notable here. If you look at the top left, this is a cover from Time magazine. It covers the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which was, although you could critique the terminology, widely discussed as a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. It was carried out on February 26th of 1993 when a truck bomb detonated below the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The 1,336-pound urate nitrate hydrogen gas enhanced device was intended to send the North Tower crashing into the second tower, the South Tower, bringing down both towers and killing tens of thousands of people. That was the design. It failed to do so, but it did actually kill 6 people and injured over 1,000. The attack was planned by a group of political activists, including Ramzi Youssef, Mahmoud Abu Khalima, Mohammed Salameh, Nidal Ayad, Abdul Rahman Yassin, and Ahmed Ajaj. They received financing from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Youssef's uncle. In March 1994, 4 men were convicted of carrying out the bombing: Abu Khalima, Ajaj, Ayad, and Salameh. The charges included conspiracy, explosive destruction of property, and interstate transportation of explosives, bringing explosives across state lines. In November 1997, 2 more individuals were convicted: Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the planned bombing, and Ayad Ismaili, who drove the truck carrying the bomb. According to the transcript of the trial, Youssef hoped that his explosion would topple both towers, killing the occupants, and he estimated that this would be around 250,000 people. The idea was that this would be vengeance for the American supplies that had gone to the Middle East to essentially conduct a series of war crimes against the Palestinian people. According to journalist Steve Cole, Youssef mailed letters to various New York newspapers just before the attack, in which he claimed he belonged to the Liberation Army. These letters made 3 demands: an end to U.S. aid to Israel and allies in the Middle East, and an end to U.S. diplomatic relations with Israel specifically, and a pledge by the United States to end interference with any Middle Eastern country's interior affairs. Of course, these demands were not met, but it seems important to note that this event occurred in 1993, then Giuliani was mayor in 1994, and then September 11th happens in 2001. Despite this, Giuliani is later going around in public claiming that before the Obama presidency, there was no successful radical Islamic terrorist attack in the United States. Fascinating claim, bit of a propagandist in a sense. Have a look at this photo. Who do you recognize here? Probably you recognize the image of Osama bin Laden, a person who's commonly associated with the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States. Although previously Osama bin Laden had been recognized as, quote, an anti-Soviet warrior who put his army on the road to peace, depicted here in The Independent, a British newspaper from the early 1990s. Osama bin Laden is a Saudi financier whose father had worked on contracts that were actually closely affiliated with American military bases in the Saudi government, was an individual who worked closely with Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the course of the Cold War, during a period where the Reagan administration dramatically increased funding for the Mujahideen as, quote, anti-Soviet warriors. The Mujahideen themselves would then diverge later into 2 groups: Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, and the Taliban government of Afghanistan. In fact, when the United States was seeking to arrest, detain, or otherwise capture Osama bin Laden, the government of the Taliban actually offered to assist the United States in that detention if the United States would simply, in accordance with international standards, present evidence that the individual had in fact been associated with the attacks. The United States federal government refused to do so and subsequently invaded Afghanistan. It turns out that Osama bin Laden was actually probably in Pakistan at the time, not even in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, This began the war in Afghanistan, as it is so known, which is an ongoing war, now probably old enough to fight itself. Al-Qaeda as an organization is in fact a much broader organization, but arguably the best-known mujahideen outside the Islamic world, various loosely aligned Afghan opposition groups, were much more deeply rooted in this anti-Soviet agency. They included figures such as Abdullah Yusuf Islam, who is an individual who became a sort of advisor to Osama early on in his career. Osama bin Laden, originally from this wealthy Saudi family, was a prominent organizer in the Mujahideen, and he sold arms for the group and coordinated efforts with Abdullah Yusuf Islam. Currently, Al-Qaeda is under the leadership of Ayman al-Zawahiri and is formally against the Assad regime in Syria. Al-Qaeda operatives are also opposed to the growth of so-called al-Daesh or ISIL in the Yemeni civil war, a civil war which has actually turned into a sort of genocide with the Saudi government committing numerous atrocities against the Yemeni people. Generally speaking, Al-Qaeda is actually opposed to ISIL and ISIS, these broader affiliates across not just the Maghreb in northern Africa, but also the Somali coast and even in Southeast Asia as well. So it's important to remember that even though the war on terror rhetoric from the Bush administration, General Colin Powell and so forth, treated these organizations as one and one and the same. In fact, sometimes Al-Qaeda and al-Daesh are actually fighting one another with a sort of proxy agreements. And this includes Russia allied with Syria in the case of the Syrian civil war, in the United States in this informal but somewhat formalized alliance with the Saud regime in Saudi Arabia. As we move forward, you might take note of any surprising features of these relationships relating up to the contemporary present.